very pleased and honored to greet you and welcome you to this evening. And we are very happy to take part in your voyage of wisdom. So thank you very much for offering this guest lecture tonight. And thank you very much also for the weeks of intensive teaching here at the Rangjung Yeshe Institute. Many of you don't need an introduction of John Dunne, but for those who do, I have something to tell you about John. John is the distinguished chair of Contemplative Humanities at the Center of Healthy Minds at the University of Madison, Wisconsin. He also holds the position of the distinguished professor in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures, for which until recently you were also the chair, right? John's work focuses on Buddhist philosophy and contemplative practice, especially in dialogue with cognitive science and psychology. His publications appear in venues ranging across both the humanities and the sciences, and they include works on Buddhist philosophy, contemplative practice, and their interpretation within scientific, philosophical, and cultural contexts. And the talk tonight will touch upon those areas. John also teaches in various Dharma centers, the Gomde in Austria and Denmark, or the Upaya Zen Center. And I think many of you have already benefited from his wisdom. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Julia. Hello. Hello. It's great to see you all, to see a number of old faces, old friends, that's to say. Maybe some of you old as well, and some new friends too. And it's a real pleasure to have been back here at Rangjung Yeshe for the last few weeks teaching and really engaging with a vibrant community. So one of the things I like about Rangjung Yeshe is that it's a Buddhist academic context. So in good Buddhist form, I'm just going to do a quick invocation here. Vidudakapana jala gambhiro dara murtaye namaha samantabhadraya samantasparana tvishay nabhavo napiyabhavo sindhu chedanapi shashvataha nanitjanapi anityastvam adhyaya namostute Serin kuki kena bizagi dalati momobaratene kadantanda shulo tobayi lodu baben nomatilda so. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today. I have a rather grandiose title, Meditation and Consciousness. Sounds like I'm going to cover all of reality practically. So we might not have quite enough time for that. We might go a tiny bit after 6:30 since we're starting late, but we'll see how it goes. And you can see from this opening slide here that I have various kinds of affiliations, and one of those affiliations is the Center for Healthy Minds, where the funding for my endowed chair was generated. And I've been working with folks from the Center for Healthy Minds for quite a long time now. And all that started way back in 2000 when, let me get this, I'm having an issue here. Here we go. That all started back around 2000. And I think this picture is from about 2000. So many of you probably recognize the gentleman in robes. That's Mathieu Ricard. And on the left is my friend and the founder of the Center for Healthy Minds, which is actually founded about 8 years after this, in 2008, Richie Davidson, who's a neuroscientist. And I met Richie because one of my students, Aaron Eamon, sort of dragged me into his office some weeks before this picture was taken, and because she wanted to work on mental health in the Tibetan refugee community. And one thing led to another. We discovered different people that we knew in common, like Alan Wallace and so on. And then it turned out that Richie really needed some help with translation because we were going to bring some advanced practitioners to Wisconsin with the help of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to begin to examine how meditation affects the mind-body system, especially with expert meditators who had done, at least 30,000 hours approximately of practice in their lifetimes, and often a lot more. So here you can see the two kinds of devices that we've been using. One of these, that machine that Mathieu is sitting on there, is an fMRI machine, a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine. And then here you have what's called a high density electroencephalograph cap that he's wearing, an EEG cap. And these were actually preparatory visits where we were trying to do the experimental design. And I got pulled in pretty quickly to act initially as just a translator for people who didn't speak English. And at that time, Mingyu Rinpoche, actually, this is a kind of staged photo, but Mingyu Rinpoche was one of the subjects. And we can release that because he's come out publicly about it. But pretty soon, that what developed first as just mostly linguistic translation for me turned into also kind of conceptual translation, cultural translation as well, but also conceptual translation. A quick example of cultural translation: when we started doing these studies with what we call adepts, very advanced practitioners, we asked them to give us assessments, what you can call phenomenological assessments of their experience. And one of those assessments is something that we simply called, to what extent did they achieve something? How much, katsu lebsong, so to speak, topja karijungsong, how much did you achieve in your practice? And Mingyu Rinpoche helped us to kind of devise the language for that. We just called it the topja. And then we started to ask these practitioners, okay, so give us a rating 0 to 10 about how your practice went in this session. And these were very short blocks because these are very advanced meditators doing a style of meditation that enabled them to drop into the state in just 3 minutes. So the blocks of meditation were just 3 minutes long. And there would be several of them. And so they'd do a block and they'd say, okay, how'd it go? Katsu Lebsong out of 0 to 10. And it'd be like, can I go negative? Can I say -1? It's like they refuse to sort of admit that they could meditate. These are, people who had done at least 1 3-year retreat. So that kind of cultural translation was also part of my task. And the way we solve that, by the way, we say, well, we know that you're not a great meditator, but can you just say for yourself, how good was that in terms of your best possible one? And then the numbers went up to like 7, 8, 9, right? So that's just an example of the kind of cultural translation that I was involved in. But I was also involved in a kind of translation between what you might call the scientific paradigm and the Buddhist paradigm, a translation that really also has come through the Mind and Life Institute, and especially through the work of the late Francisco Varela, who was one of the co-founders, along with Adam Engel, of the Mind and Life Institute. And I've been quite involved in the Mind and Life Institute over the years. And part of what Francisco Varela in particular brought to the study of meditation practices was a particular kind of theory that was driving the work that we were doing at that time, that's called neurophenomenology. And basically, the idea here in neurophenomenology is that one's going to take what's called third-person perspectives, third-person measures, for example, EEG or fMRI, and one's going to align them with phenomenological measures, accounts of the experience that a person is having. And of course, one of the key aspects, one of the key issues with experience, with phenomenology, is the problem of getting a good report. Because as it turns out, most ordinary people are not very good at reporting on their own experience. They actually often bring what are called satellite interpretations. They bring in a lot of concepts. Instead of describing their experience as it's occurring, they talk about something else, in effect. Or they don't even notice certain aspects of their own experience when you ask them to report on it, even though we can assess behaviorally that those aspects of experience must have been happening. So one of the reasons that we worked with these advanced meditators is that they're very well trained to observe experience. But also we were interfacing not just with their capacity to observe experience well, but also with, as it turns out, as time developed, with the kind of theoretical frameworks that guide meditation practice and that also try to account for how meditation practices work. So then in 2007, we wrote this article in the Cambridge Handbook of Consciousness. So if you're not sure how to be conscious, you can just buy the handbook and it'll tell you. No, I'm kidding. And this was one of our sort of first productions when this collaboration between French scientist Antoine Lutz, who was Francisco Varela's last student in Paris, and then Richie Davidson, whose picture you saw before, and myself, where we're really trying to understand how meditation practices are operating, both from a scientific perspective, but also from the standpoint of the Buddhist theories. However, you can't just tell, a neuroscientist, read Dharmakirti. That doesn't really work very well. You can't just give them straightforwardly Buddhist accounts, because without the context of how those Buddhist accounts make sense, in other words, you can't just give them the list of the mental functions from the Semjung, from the Abhidharma, because they won't really understand how those mental functions are being interpreted. So what happens in this kind of an interaction is there's going to be a new kind of language that evolves when you do this type of what we call transdisciplinary work. We don't just speak our own home language, so to speak. The scientists also need to change the way in which they speak, and that generates, in a sense, a new kind of way of looking at things. And so part of the talk I want to give you today is really to speak a little bit about that process, like what's involved methodologically in doing that, taking Buddhist accounts and trying to translate them into a way in which scientists can also engage with them. So one of the things that we did do in that paper is we talked about how certain styles of practice, and here we were thinking, and this is a lot of this emerged out of conversation actually with Mingyur Rinpoche, Chukyi Rinpoche's younger brother. And this is an account of how there are different, especially in the gradual style of practice in Mahamudra and Dzogchen, the sort of Chak Dzog style, if you like, how one can start with focus on an object, then start to decrease the level of focus on an object until finally, in principle, one reaches a state in which there is no longer any focus on an object or the subject, actually, which would be a true non-dual style of awareness. In some ways, this is really tracking what you might call shamatha with an object, but there's, in that last row there, it's a gesture toward, you might say, the kind of practice of Rigpa, as you might call it, Rigpa Choshak, for example, a practice of the nature of the mind itself. And in that final column on the right-hand side, you see, so you have row 4 is where you no longer, in a sense, have an object or subject in your meditative experience. And what you have a very strong emphasis on what's called reflexive awareness, which is something we're going to talk about. So that's going to be a kind of theme for this talk. How do you make sense of reflexive awareness in meditation, but also how do you make sense of it in a way that enables one to do work with scientists in the study of meditation? So after this paper, we then wrote another paper, and we were and this is a pretty prominent journal in cognitive science called Trends in Cognitive Sciences, or TICS. And they put us on the cover. We were really quite surprised that in 2008 they put us on the cover. And the paper that was in the journal is this one, Attention Regulation and Monitoring and Meditation, in which Antoine and I were also joined by Helene Slachter, a scientist from the Netherlands, who was at Madison at that time. And this is one of the highest cited meditation papers actually out there right now, with I think around 3,000 citations, so that, which is an awful lot of citations for a scientific article. And the reason this is cited is primarily this part of the article, where we invented, and this is something to think about, like how do you have this conversation? So prior to this time, there's a lot of text there. Don't feel like you have to read all that text. Prior to this time, when scientists talked about that they were doing meditation studies, so this is 2008, already there are, if you look at, I don't have this graph in this particular slide deck, but there you can look at very dramatic increase in the number of scientific publications on meditation that starts in the late 1990s and really takes off in the early 2000s. But up until around 2008, when people studied meditation, they just said meditation. They said, we studied meditation, and this is what happened. They didn't say whether it was TM, and some of the studies were on TM, whether it was a Zen form of meditation, whether it was shamatha, whether it was some form of mindfulness, whether it was deity yoga. They just treated meditation as if it were a black box. So you quite literally would read a scientific paper and you'd have no idea what kind of meditation the person was doing. which, if you're familiar with meditation and also with the theory about meditation, especially theory of mind, the so-called, you could call it Buddhist psychology, you'll know that different kinds of meditation practices have different kinds of effects. So we needed to make something that scientists could use. However, we didn't want to enumerate, for example, well, there's Chakra Samvara and Guhya Samaja and Vajra Yogini, and then there's the Kyerim and the Dzogrim. And within the Kyerim, there are different styles of Kyerim, and then there's the body isolation and the speech isolation and the mind isolation. And by the way, there's no full, completely agreement about all of the subtle body in Tantra. And besides Tantra, by the way, we also have Lojong practices, which include, for example, Tonglen. And, you could just go on and on with the number of different practices. So that's not going to help scientists, actually, to distinguish even the kind of Chegom, Jogom, analytic meditation, placement meditation distinction is not a very useful one for scientists to use. So in this kind of conversation, what we came up with was a distinction between what we called FA and OM. And these stand for focused attention meditation and open monitoring meditation. And this very simple distinction, actually, part of the reason that we use this very simple distinction is that at this time, what we were primarily interested in was the regulation of attention, the capacity to regulate the attention and have sustained attention, and most especially the capacity to deal with distraction. So that's where these categories emerge from. That's only a subset of interests for Buddhism, of course. Being attentive is extremely important, but that's not the end of the story. But for the purposes of this scientific study, it was useful for us to come up with these categories. So it's quite interesting to see then how the reason this paper now has some, I think, 3,000 citations is that these kinds of categories have become very widespread. And of course, now we need to update them. And they have been updated a little bit. We need to get more finely grained. But part of what this enabled us to do is to start working together. And here's some of the collaborators that I was working with after that time. And finally, in 2015, we, Cliff Sarin at UC Davis, Amishi Jha at the University of Miami, Antoine Lutz, who at this time is now at ENSERM in Lyon, we worked together to write this paper in 2000, which came out in 2015, investigating the phenomenological matrix of mindfulness-related practices from a neurocognitive perspective. It's quite a mouthful. Antoine likes long titles, so I'll blame it on Antoine. And so part of what we're doing now is we're trying to take those categories of different, very simplistic categories of different styles of meditation, and then trying to understand how we can give phenomenological accounts of the meditative experiences. How can we generate a model to gather phenomenological data that will be useful phenomenological data where meditators report on their experience, and then align that with neurocognitive data, neuroscientific data. The idea here being not that we're going to sort of solve the mystery of consciousness, for example, what's called the hard problem. Scientists think of this in terms of the brain being the starting point as a physical thing. I love my collaborator and friend Michel Boutbol likes to say, well, shouldn't we start from consciousness itself? But setting that aside, the whole problem of how consciousness arises from a supposedly physical substratum is called the hard problem. We're not trying to solve that, but we are trying to solve how certain aspects of attention and the regulation of attention, including the regulation of emotions, work, because as it turns out, this is critically important for mental health. So a very large portion of our motivation here, which is what the Center for Healthy Minds is all about, and why His Holiness Dalai Lama has been so encouraging for us, is how can we relieve at least some forms of suffering by using forms of meditation that have been secularized, like a mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is a very widespread form of meditation practice. How can we know that those seem to be working, that these various forms of mindfulness interventions, as we call them, seem to be working, but why do they work? How do they work? What's the relationship between the experiences that people have and the kinds of changes we see in in their behavior and in their bodies. So with that in mind, then we wrote this paper and we generated this model. So some of you may be familiar with how a weather map works. So when you have a weather map with a single dot, which represents a weather station, you can include a lot of data. So the way in which that weather map is drawn can tell you the wind speed, it can tell you the wind direction, it can tell you the temperature, it can even tell you whether it's cloudy or rainy and so on. Just by all of that just can be contained in just one symbol in one location. So that's kind of what inspired us here. How can we represent multiple different variables in a kind of space that enables us to understand and to theorize about how different kinds of meditation might affect the mind-body system? And what this matrix does is it takes 7 different qualities, 7 different features of meditation, 3 primary features: meta-awareness, object orientation, and dereification, and then 4 secondary features: aperture, clarity. So you should see aperture, clarity. You can see yes, good, you can see it. Aperture, clarity, stability, and effort. And then these are marked. We can then represent a particular kind of state in this state space where there's a certain degree of meta-awareness, there's a certain degree of object orientation, a certain degree of dereification. For example, here's a novice practitioner of open monitoring. And then the height up here is how much meta-awareness is. Their location here is how much object orientation there is. The location here is how much dereification there is, right? So that's here, and I'll go through those qualities in a second. And then this, the fact that this is kind of a medium size indicates a medium effort. How the fact that this is kind of a medium red circle means that there's a medium degree of stability, which means how likely the state is to change in the next moment. How likely are you to lose the state, so to speak, the target state in the next moment? This medium kind of color here represents a medium degree of clarity, which was one of the phenomenological features we actually first gathered from our early subjects there. So we would call this the selcha. This was the necha, the stability. And then the aperture, in other words, how large an object, if there is any object, how large an object you have in the practice. Is it the entire sky, for example, or is it just the sensations at the nostril? Right, so that's the aperture. So these, now, of course, one thing that's very important here is that this is not designed to capture all forms of meditation. It's not even designed to capture all forms in a way. It's not even designed to capture all forms of meditation within any particular style. It's trying to get most forms of mindfulness, most of the relevant forms of mindfulness that one would find in lay practitioners, but also in a kind of mindfulness style of practice. And I'll say a little more about what that means, but also in advanced practitioners coming out of Buddhist traditions. But for example, you can't really fully represent. Remember, we had that fourth state here, which would be something like Rigpa Choshak, or real absorption in the nature of the mind. That fourth state is difficult to represent in this space, right? Because in principle, of course, you have no object at all. And the choice of the term open monitoring was in a way a kind of setting aside the question of people who might be in that state, who are really in a completely non-dual form of awareness. That is, we often reserve the term open presence for that. And monitoring, of course, as a term implies a certain kind of dualistic orientation toward you're paying attention to something. But as you'll see, as we worked further on these questions, we started to really move toward the idea of monitoring itself, especially what's called the meta-awareness involved in monitoring, as being necessarily non-dual. So let me explain very briefly these features. These, in some ways, these are easiest. Apertures, that I've already said, the width. Clarity is how intense or clear the meditative state is. Stability, pretty obvious. Is it going to degrade in the next moment or not? And then effort, also quite obvious. You know, how much effort, subjectively, how much effort is the person experiencing? Then in these three, which are the primary, are a little less obvious, but extremely important for understanding different styles of practice. So object orientation basically means when you have an instruction set and you're engaging in a meditation practice, does that instruction set say you need to pay as much attention as possible to the object? Or does the instruction set, for example, you'll find in the Chachang Gyatso, you'll find the idea that you use the breath, for example, but you don't use it. It says in the Chachang Gyatso that the breath is like a jeto, which means like a reminder. It's not actually the object. So your mind is on the breath, but that's not the object of your meditation. So that in that instruction style, your object orientation is very reduced. You are using an object, but the object is very minimal. There's very minimal amount of cognitive mojo, so to speak, a minimal amount of your cognitive resources are being devoted to focusing on the object, as opposed to something like so-called jhana practice, where you're intensely focusing on an object. And the point of that practice is to cultivate an extremely high level of one-pointed awareness, right? Or ekagrata in Sanskrit, semsechik. So that's object orientation. Meta-awareness is the degree to which there's an emphasis on an awareness not just of an object, but also of the background in which that object, in which the awareness is occurring. And I'm going to explain more about meta-awareness. That's going to be sort of the theme for the rest of this talk as we get through this model here, so that you'll understand it more. But you can think of meta-awareness as basically what provides the capacity to monitor. All right, we'll come back to that. And it's going to be closely related to reflexivity or reflexive awareness. And then finally, de-reification is in that instruction set, how much emphasis is placed on the capacity to recognize thoughts as thoughts. So for example, you can have styles of meditation practice in which when a distraction arises or a thought arises, let's say, maybe you're hungry right now and you're thinking of a nice plate of momos. So delicious. And if you think enough about food, especially around, dinner time or lunchtime or what have you, your mouth will start to water because your mind-body system thinks the thought is a real thing, and it causes a physiological reaction. This is also, of course, one of the main pathways for stress for humans. Robert Sapolsky wrote a book some years ago, this Stanford scientist, called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And one reason, a big reason for that is that zebras can't think this way, but humans can. We can experience our thoughts as reality, our thoughts of the past and our thoughts of the future, and what's called mental time travel. We can experience them as such a strong reality that we almost feel like we're reliving or anticipating the experience itself. And that has tremendous impacts on the body, especially when those kinds of thoughts are stressful thoughts. So that's one of the things we're quite interested in therapeutic effects of mindfulness style practices. So after we wrote this, then I worked with some other colleagues, Evan Thompson, the philosopher, Jonathan Schooler, the cognitive scientist, neuroscientist, to really start to understand a little bit more about what meta-awareness is. And in 2019, we came out with this article, which has also already had quite a few citations, called Mindful Meta-Awareness, Sustained and Non-Propositional. And I'll explain the title. I'll explain to you what that means soon. But first, let's talk a little bit about what are some of the features when we say something's a mindfulness style practice. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's called a mindfulness practice in the tradition that it's occurring in. It will be a mindfulness practice usually if we're looking at secularized practices, but even then sometimes there are some secular style of training that are effectively mindfulness practices, but they don't use that word. So what are some of the main features? And remember, mindfulness practices, including the theory about mindfulness, is really initially emerging out of Buddhist sources. And so what's one of the main features here is the idea of smrti, which is this Sanskrit term on the right? And that's what the term mindfulness translates from the 19th century. That's for better or worse. It's some question whether that's the best translation, but in any case, that's what we have. Smrti literally means memory. And but in the context of meditation practices, when it's used as a technical term coming out of the Abhidharma, what you find kind of across the board is what memory, it's a kind of metaphor. In other words, when you're remembering something, you're not forgetting, right? So what do we mean that if so, let's say you're trying to pay attention to your breath. If you lose track of your breath, you've forgotten the breath, you've lost the breath, right? So distraction, you can say, is a kind of forgetting. So what is distraction? It's when you have what's called attention capture, involuntary attention capture. So you're trying to focus on your breath, and you start to think about, oh, what am I going to do next week on the break? And suddenly you're not paying attention to the breath anymore, right? So that's a form of distraction, or vikshepa, or nyingwa in Tibetan, or namying. And so mindfulness is what just simply is what prevents you from being lost. So it is, so George Jarvis and I at one point thought, well, maybe we should translate it as, attention retention, like our kind of retentive focus. Because it's not telling you this, it's when we think of it just as this kind of a chittasika, a semjung, a mental function, it's not telling you how clear you are on the object. It's not telling you whether you are seeing the object in its true nature. All it's telling you is that your attention is not being pulled away by something else. Okay, so that's a key feature of mindfulness. And that's kind of what runs across these different styles of practice, is that in one way or another, they're interested in working with distraction. But then there's also, at the same time, we need something that enables us to manage distraction. We need something that enables us to notice that distraction is happening. So this, and the term here in Sanskrit is samprajanya. That's what you have on the right hand, or in Tibetan, shejin. So often when you hear about mindfulness style practices in Tibetan, you'll hear both drempa, that's smrti, and shejin together. They'll say they make a compound, denshe, right? So, and that will be like the meditation is both of those together. And that's, of course, and certainly in terms of the attentional features, the cognitive features of that practice, this is really key. You have both this capacity to not have attention capture, but then you have to have something that notices. And this can happen, this noticing is what we mean by meta-awareness, right? Noticing what's happening in the mind. That's it. Your awareness of awareness, although you're going to see that that's a little complicated when we say it quite that way. But so, for example, many of you may have had the experience of maybe listening to this talk or reading an article, and then after a couple of minutes, you realize you've been reading, but you have no idea what you read, right? And you have a moment, you go, oh, I haven't been paying attention at all. Or you're sitting on the cushion trying to do some kind of meditation practice, and you realize that, you're on the beach in Goa, actually. You're not paying attention to your breath. So there's a moment where that happens, right? Where you go, oh, I am distracted. That's called explicit meta-awareness. And when you do that, you pay attention to your own mind, right? So that's explicit meta-awareness. And that form of meta-awareness is where you are actually doing what's called introspection, right? Where you actually turn inward and notice the contents of your own mind. Now, one problem, of course, with this is if one says that your meditation practice requires you to turn inward and check whether you are distracted, what that means is you've lost the object. So in a sense, that moment of introspecting is a kind of distraction in a way, because if you're supposed to be paying attention to the breath, but then you have to periodically check, am I distracted? Am I distracted? You have to lose the breath in order for you to do the introspection, to see what's happening in your mind. There are theories of how mindfulness style practices work, which say that this is what you do, and then as you get better, you stop needing to check, right? So that's one account of how samprajanya or shejin or meta-awareness works in meditation. But there's another kind of meta-awareness, right? But so in that case, this meta-awareness has to be intermittent, right? It's not sustained from the title of that article. It has to be intermittent, which means that it's only occurring when it's explicit, like, how's it going? So that's an explicit moment of checking the contents of your mind. But there's another kind of account in which meta-awareness is actually reflexive. And we will explain what that means. And that reflexive form of meta-awareness can be continuous or sustained. So in order for us to understand what that means, now we're going to take a little dive into Dharmakirti, of course, right? My favorite. And one of the verses I cited at the beginning was a verse from Dharmakirti. So you probably know he's a 7th century philosopher. He wrote Buddhist philosopher. He wrote in Sanskrit. He was, of course, very influential, both the later Indian tradition and also for the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. There's a long commentarial tradition connected to him, and it's still studied these days right here at Rangjung Yishi in the monk Shedra and also in the Buddhist studies program. So let me give you I'm just going to give you kind of a very short summary of certain key features of Dharmakirti's theory of cognition. And so this is going to be kind of down and dirty. So, you know, there are a lot of details that need to be left out, but that's okay. So a basic model of sense perception for Dharmakirti, which of course includes also mental sensing, in other words, being aware of thoughts. A basic model of sense perception is there's a stimulus, it interacts with the faculty, and then what it produces is what's called the Zungnam in Tibetan, or the Grahyakara, the phenomenal form of the object, right? So you don't see things directly, you see in your consciousness, you see the result of the interaction between some object and your sense faculty. So when you're seeing blue, you're not actually seeing something out there, you're actually seeing something presented in consciousness. So that's the phenomenal form of the object. And at the same time, simultaneously arising with that is a phenomenal form of the subject, a sense of subjectivity. So in other words, as you're looking at the blue, actually that blue color is not outside, it's within your consciousness, right? Light is reflecting, it's hitting your retina. If we kind of update this to modern, scientific accounts, light at a certain frequency is hitting your retina. That gets translated along the optic nerve, eventually gets to what's called V1, the back of the brain, and then that gets processed. And at a certain point, in a way in which neuroscientists find completely baffling, you actually see something. But that takes a little while. So the other interesting thing here is you're always you don't see the object in real time. You're always a little delayed when you're seeing objects. You don't see them in that moment. And what you're seeing is the way your visual system represents color, for example, which was Francisco Varela's favorite example here. You don't see, if you were a dog, you would see a different kind of color. You would also, if there were any ultraviolet here, it appears that dogs, for example, see ultraviolet to a certain extent. So you don't see the way humans see one kind of thing, dogs see another kind of thing, other kinds of creatures see other kinds of things. So in other words, in their experience. So what you're seeing when you see the blue is you're not seeing the object directly, you're seeing a representation in consciousness. At the same time, there's a sense of the blue's over there, which means there's a sense that's being represented of you being the one who's seeing, a sense of there being a seer, someone who's having that experience. And that's this with the smiley face. I always like to think our subjectivity is happy. That's that sense of being the subject that's doing the seeing, right? So that creates this structure. So that's a kind of structure in awareness that's dualistic. And that's called, in Western philosophy and phenomenology, it's called intentionality, right? So subject, object, intentionality. So if we then take that and look at it a little bit more precisely, in time one, you have that interaction. In time two, you get those phenomenal form of the object and the subject. And then in time three, what happens is, if you're really paying attention, you're going to conceptualize it because you're interested in it. And if you're interested in it, you want to do something with it. And as an ordinary being, if you want to do something with it, you have to conceptualize it. Ordinary beings cannot act without conceptualization, according to Dharmakirti. So what that, and of course, that doesn't mean that this is just a picture. Like we already know, if you, depending on your kinds of faculties, you're going to see different things, different colors, but also your expectations. This is the gunk that you're working with. Your gunk, whatever it is, your expectations, your emotional states, your appetites, all of those are also going to affect the way this looks. So it's not just a snapshot of the world. It's actually already conditioned by your states. But in any case, though, we will say that this is, even though it's conditioned, it's non-conceptual and this is conceptual. So this is a case in which what we say the object form is playing, and that's where most of the time, that's what we pay attention to. We pay attention to objects because the theory here, according to Dharmakirti, is we want the good stuff and we don't want the bad stuff. We're always trying to get the good stuff and avoid the bad stuff. And that's how our systems work. Interestingly, that very much aligns with certain theories in cognitive science called the inactive view, where, basically organisms, consciousness itself is about getting the good stuff and avoiding the bad stuff. So therefore, we're just focused on objects. We don't generally pay much attention to what's not the object, but still within experience, right? But sometimes we'll have an occasion where we suddenly, for whatever reason, that's representation of the subject, which includes not just the sense of being, right, located in a particular spatio-temporal location, like right here or relation to over there, but also stuff like how you're feeling, are you in pain, are you anxious, and so on, that stuff also gets represented. And so if you're in a difficult conversation, for example, you might start to notice that even though you're focused on the argument, you might start to notice that you're getting a little upset. Hopefully you do anyway. And this is why meta-awareness is very important for mental health. And if you do, then that subject side can also act as a basis for conceptualization, right? So that's, in that case, the subject is going to produce something like, oh, I'm upset, for example, or, oh, I'm anxious. But it's very important to notice structurally here that when this acts in that way causally, it is not being presented as an object, right? There isn't another subjectivity that's this, your own sense of subjectivity is not, at this moment, is not an object for some other sense of subjectivity, right? At this point, this now counts as introspection. This is that explicit moment like, oh, I'm upset, or oh, I'm distracted. But here, so here we have this, in a sense, your own self, you're thematizing your own self, your own experiences, you're turning inward. But here, even this sense of subjectivity that's acting as the cause for this conceptualization is not being presented as an object. We're going to come back to that because that's a very important feature here. Let me give you an example of why that's, or how that's working. Okay, so let's just suppose, we're in Austria at this beautiful place called Gomde, Austria, and we're just sort of hanging out inside, waiting for a course to start or whatever. And then suddenly someone comes running in and says, "Oh, you got to come outside. Come, you have to have a look." And then we all go outside and we see this, which is an actual photo taken by Mickey this past summer of an incredible double rainbow that we saw above Gomde, Austria. And and then, so let's say we do that, we go to see that, we both like completely, we're all totally absorbed in it. And then we go back inside and a minute later, I ask you, so how did you feel when you were looking at the rainbow? Do you say, I don't know, because I was paying attention to the rainbow. I wasn't paying attention to my feelings. Or can you remember your feelings even though you were completely focused on the rainbow? Do you say to me, you know what? Give me a second. I'm going to go back outside. Then I'm going to look at the rainbow. And then I'm quickly going to look in to see how I feel. Is that what you have to do? Do you already have the information to report on your feelings, even though you weren't paying attention to your feelings? If you're, walking along here in Boda and some crazy motorcyclist comes too fast and almost hits you and I have to pull you out of the way, if I say, how, and you're staring, you're clearly paying attention to the motor, totally focused on it because you have to know which way to go, and you get out of the way. And then I say to you, were you afraid when that happened? And you go, I don't know. I was paying attention to the motorcycle. I can't tell if I was, let's do it again. And I'll check if I'm afraid when motorcycles come at me. Is that how it works? Or is the memory of the experience, does it include your emotional state, especially if it's an intense emotional state, right? So this is what we call, this is the problem of what we call, and this is from the philosopher Thomas Metzinger, good old-fashioned intentionality, which is our usual sense, like there's a subject and there's an object, and we're just sort of straightforwardly, naively focusing on objects, and there's a subject, and we don't actually know the subject. It's not part of our experience in a way. But this way of depicting that, what he calls the phenomenal model of the intentionality relation, is very close to what Dharmakirti is trying to say, which is that the sense of being a subject is presented along with the object simultaneously. We might think that what we need to do is we have to look as a separate subject to look at ourselves. So you might think, oh, how do I know my own emotions while the motorcycle's coming at me, or why I'm seeing the rainbow? Well, there's some other sense of subjectivity that's looking at my sense of subjectivity, and then it's going to report on that. But then how do you know that this sense of subjectivity is in a sense yourself? How do you have an awareness of that? Do you need another subjectivity to know that you have the subjectivity that's noticing your own subjectivity? And this is, of course, the classic argument that you find in the Buddhist phenomenological, rather pramana tradition, and also in the Western phenomenological tradition, that's called an infinite regress argument for reflexive awareness. If you need a higher order subjectivity, you end up in this kind of an infinite regress. So when we have this situation in which the subject form is causally dominant, the subject form there is not, we don't have that information because we're looking at the subject form. It's presented to us simultaneously. And that both of them, so that information is being presented in our experience without it being an object, right? So what that means is that that moment is being presented reflexively, which is to say it's being presented. So that's actually a grammatical term. It means that instead of, if you know French, for example, instead of saying je vois ça, I see that, I can use a reflexive pronoun also in Spanish and say ça se voit. You can't translate that into English. You have to translate it as a passive, like that is seen. But in French, it almost means like that sees itself, right? But it's not a transitive action. It's not a subject. It's not I see that. It's like the thing is just being seen. It's just being presented. So that's the sense of reflexive awareness that is occurring, according to Dharmakirti, in every moment of awareness. And in fact, this is what is said to be the essential feature of awareness. This is what accounts for a sense of being conscious. So let me give you, so this is why we call this, for example, an intransitive and also therefore non-dual awareness. Because since, if we go back here, since this, we're going to take this as being presented and then we're going to make a conceptualization about it, this is not being presented as an object. So that means our sense of subjectivity is actually presented to us non-dually, because it's not being presented in subject-object structure, which means there's an aspect of awareness in every moment that is already non-dual. Right? And so Dharmakirti claims that this non-dual reflexive awareness is the nature of awareness. And his commentators say it also is really the nature of Buddha consciousness. In other words, it is Buddha nature. It's the Tathagata. So when we say that it's intransitive and non-dual, it's not presenting itself. When we know objects, I know that's transitive, but this is actually not being known transitively, right? A sense of subjectivity is being constantly presented along with the object. So for example, if I make a sound, right? I'm going to make a sound, and if you listen very closely to the sound, you'll get a prize. Ready? Boop. Now I have a question for you. Were you sitting down when you heard the sound? You say, well, I remember sitting down when I came in the room, and I don't remember standing up. So I must have been sitting down when you made the sound. Or is your body position included in the memory of the experience? You know it. Do you have any doubts that does anyone doubt whether they were sitting down? Some people, okay, maybe. Let me try this. When I made the sound, did you feel like you were the one hearing it, or was somebody else? Huh? Right? Like there's a sense of this is, of course, in the Buddhist world, this is a problem, but that sense of it's for me, the sound is presented to my subjectivity. Do you have a sense of, actually, no, I think it was the person next to me hearing the sound. I wasn't hearing it. Do you have that sense? Some and certain forms of psychosis actually do have that, but right? The sense of that being presented to you, it's like almost a ridiculous question. Right? So that's the way in which our subjectivity is constantly presented non-dually and reflexively. Right? So this presentation, moment by moment presentation of subjectivity is intransitive. And it has to be non-dual because it's not being presented as the object of some other consciousness or the object of some subject, right? So that's why we say that this, in every moment of consciousness, is a non-dual reflexive awareness. And the metaphor for that in Sanskrit is prakasha or luminosity, because it's like turning on the light. You kind of turn on the light in the room, the light of consciousness, and whatever in there is going to be presented. Now, can you always report on what's in there? That's a really interesting question, right? There's lots of stuff that's being presented to us and that we may even have some feeling for, but we can't quite describe what it is. But there are some things that we have a very easy time describing, and they would be, for example, let me ask you all this question. Are you conscious right now? It's not a trick question. Right? And if you feel, if you're not conscious, raise your hand. So how do you know you're conscious? Just know. It's like, it's just part of the experience. The sense of being conscious is presented with the experience. You don't have to figure it out. Do you have to make an effort to know whether you're conscious? Like, let me work on it. I'm going to check. It's just given with your experience. So that's part of this idea of reflexivity. The sense of being conscious is just presented with experience. And under certain conditions, you can induce states in which there are no contents, there's no objects and no subjects, and yet you still feel conscious, right? So that's exactly what we're talking about, in the sense that what is the same about every moment of consciousness, and this is where the Buddhist tradition diverges from the Western phenomenological tradition, is that consciousness does not require the subject-object structure. You can still be conscious without it, because reflexivity is what's necessary for subject-object structure, but it can persist without the subject-object structure, right? So now when we're trying to understand whether the context in which this occurs, it's like the monitoring meditation. When that monitoring is ongoing, then then if we have that theory, then this reflexivity has to be what's accounting for that kind of monitoring. We're not judging, we're not saying, oh, I'm distracted, but it's what enables us to make that judgment at some point. Our awareness of our emotions, of our body position, or of our location in space, of our location in time. When we're lucid dreaming, and if you do dream yoga practice and you have that sense of this is a dream, you can report that and say that, but also the sense, if you've been in a lucid dream, the sense of the reality you're experiencing as a dream is not something you have to constantly think about. It's just presented. The experience simply appears that way, right? But it's appearing that way not because you're objectifying it, but because you're actually experiencing the dream consciousness itself non-dually. And then, of course, that sense of consciousness itself. And interestingly, one area I'm very interested in is the role that this plays in social and collaborative cognition. So in short, when we say that there is a kind of mindful meta-awareness that's cultivated with certain styles of practice, that those styles of practice are going to be styles of practice that are really working on not that explicit moment, but more this implicit moment. You're not thinking about yourself, but rather in that ongoing way, your awareness is being presented to you. So if we think about this basic kind of style here, you could have in level 1, you're really focusing on an object, maybe to get some stability. You're putting a lot of your cognitive resources into focusing on the object. And then you slowly start to release your focus on the object until finally all that's left is the monitoring. And maybe you drop the object altogether. So that is a way, that's a style of practice, of non-dual practice, that it is coming through what's called objectless shamatha. So that you start with an object and then you gradually decrease until you finally just drop the object altogether. So that cultivates in very important ways, that heightens your capacity for meta-awareness. And this is also in the style of practice that this is known as is in the Chakshen tradition, Mahamudra, it's called mindfulness as mere non-distraction, Mind&Science, and it's called mere because you're not mindful of anything, right? There's also another metaphor here is what's called the spy of mindfulness, the Jempe Sowa or Soba. So there's a lot of stuff I could say. There's some important things about effort that I could say, but the main thing here is to come back here. If we look at this now we kind of can understand if you're doing open monitoring as an expert, what you're doing is you're really emphasizing meta-awareness. You have very little orientation toward an object. Maybe you have, maybe you occasionally come back to an object, but maybe not. You're also, because you are sustaining that state effortlessly, and actually the more effort you make, the more difficult it is because effort produces duality. I won't explain that now, but we'll pick it up in the few minutes of questions we might do. And of course, you're also going to have a very high level of dereification because you're not treating your thoughts as reality. Because when you have that very high level of meta-awareness, you recognize that thoughts are just thoughts. So therapeutically, this turns out to be extremely important because we find that in a number of different mental health contexts, difficulties arise when people have a lack of meta-awareness. It's not just about monitoring their emotions, but it's also about a capacity, for example, to see that their thoughts are just thoughts. So without meta-awareness, for example, you really can't do dereification. And in fact, sometimes experientially for people, they seem to be the same. There's more I could say, but I'm going to leave it at that so we can take maybe 5 minutes of questions. Thanks for your attention.
Hello.
Hello.
Always a true delight to listen to you, John. I might be getting something wrong here, but there was this idea about the self-reporting, kind of matching up the machine reporting, or how can the machine reporting or other kinds of scientific data, how can we make that kind of jive or interact with self-reporting? I'm a literary theorist, self-narration, whatever you want to call it. So in this explanation that you gave about self-reflexivity, there's this kind of the automatic one that's just there.
Yes.
As opposed to this explicit one.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, with self-narration itself, there's going to be some kind of analogy, yeah? So that sometimes like you are explicitly reporting.
Yeah.
But now I'm thinking about like the wonderful man that sometimes lives all the way upstairs, how that narration itself is going to comes about kind of automatically. So what I'm asking you is, there's something to be seen about how these kinds of meditation could eventually lead to this sort of speech that is just long dole. It's just coming.
Yes, so that's this is of course the real, in the tradition, the challenge of how you can have non-dual, how can you, like some parts of the Indian Buddhist tradition basically said to have non-dual awareness, there can't be any content. So if a Buddha is continually in non-dual awareness, they don't actually see anything. They only seem to see things from our standpoint. From their standpoint, they don't. But the other kind of approach really emphasizes stuff like lila or rolpa, or in Dzogchen, tsel, Rigbeit tsel. And in that case, there's this sense in which they're kind of spontaneous, effortless, because it can't be, like the word flundup and the word tsulme. So tsulme means without, sulwa, without effort. They both translate anaboga. They both translate the negative of this term, aboga. And so the idea here is that if there's some kind of spontaneous non-dual performance, if you like, or activity, it would have to not involve effort, because if it involves effort, it's going to be dualistic. So yeah, I mean, the important thing is that automaticity in itself is not non-dual. So people get confused. They think flow states, for example, must be non-dual, and that on this account, that would not be true. Those states are not. They're still being presented with an intentional structure, with a subject-object, with subject-object intentionality. So automaticity doesn't at all mean that you're in a non-dual state. But the idea that somehow there's a different kind of, activity that could arise out of that pure reflexive consciousness, that of course is very important for the late Indian tradition, if not before. Lila. Rolpa. Play.
I'm going to ask you to kind of speculate. You know, you're talking about 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And I remember one day, you know, after doing all kinds of meditation, I walked in on my mom and she's praying the rosary. And I said, hey, Mom, you know, she didn't even look up. She's going. But, you know, if you look forward 20 years with everything you know, can you say maybe, you know, with school children, you know, they could really benefit from meditation. Can you say probably maybe this might be better than this? And, you know.
Yes, yeah, actually we can.
Yeah.
And it's also very individual. So one of the things that we're very interested in the Center for Healthy Minds in my work with scientists is the idea that one size does not fit all. You know, this is not it's not a store where you buy a shirt and everyone gets the same size. It's meditation practices, and of course this is also very traditional in Buddhism, need to be tailored to people's issues, so to speak, and also not just dealing with issues, but how can they be enhanced, right? How can people you know, flourish? And so, for example, a person who has a great deal of difficulty with emotion regulation is almost certainly going to have issues with meta-awareness. So a style of practice that actually emphasizes very strong one-pointed focus would probably be bad for them. It would not help them. It'd probably make them worse.
So where would you put your money in 2040?
Yeah.
On a 20-year-old that you know might maybe give him better mental health. You know?
It would depend on the particular 20-year-old, but I would say that in general, what we find is that because of the contemporary life it deals so much with distraction. There are so many distractors now in contemporary life, which mostly come from devices. And we also see a correlation. We don't see any causation. We don't know causally. There are some theories about how the causation works, but we see a very, very strong correlation in time between the use of smartphones and anxiety and depression in adolescence, like huge increases in anxiety and depression in adolescence around the world, but especially in the United States and in Europe, very strong increases. And those increases correlate historically just in terms of time with the smartphone. And part of that is almost certainly that distraction itself is just a disturbing experience to be constantly distracted in that way. There are other reasons as well. So probably styles of practice that are really focused on dealing with distraction, which is different than gating. So gating, one way to gating refers to like your mother, you know, she's focused on the rosary, just really focused on that thing, and just really doesn't hear anything else. That is a way of inhibiting distraction, but that's not the kind of that. The problem with that, of course, is that it's very fragile, right? And you can just do this. You can't flexibly move around and attend to other objects. So the kind of working with distraction that's probably better for modern life is going to be a more open style of practice, you know, a more open monitoring style of practice where people learn to, in a sense, still have these things happen, but they don't get caught in them. So rather than gating, just preventing things from happening, you develop a different relationship with your devices, with your thoughts, with the distractors, so that they no longer cause attention capture. So I would say that, and most of the kind of contemporary styles of mindfulness really are mostly open practices, but there's, you know, I think in terms of the research, we're starting to see that meta-awareness is critically important, but also de-reification is extremely important. And, you know, the ability to experience thoughts just as thoughts and not reality. And not all styles are teaching that. So it's probably going to be a combination of these two, where we live now. Westerners have done this for a long time, but kind of the whole world now is living in a very conceptually rich environment, constantly bombarded with kind of this conceptual information, stories about themselves and the world, you know, news, most of it bad. And that the capacity to sort of not just get caught mentally in the reality, it's the seeming reality of those conceptual accounts is going to be also very important. So it's 1843. Maybe we should give it up unless there's another really burning question. One more question. Okay.
Sorry, John. I think you probably already answered my question, but I might just ask anyway. Thank you for this wonderful talk. I'm wondering, you mentioned earlier this type of research really have a aim to relieve a temporary suffering of mental health. I'm wondering, in the experience of a depressed mind, if that person train what is happening for that person to train meditation in order to relieve that? Is it to become familiar, for her or him to become familiar of this reflective awareness, getting familiar that thoughts is just a thought, you know?
You could say that. It's like, yes, improving. So everyone has, all humans have meta awareness, and theoretically all conscious beings have it. Because it's required for consciousness. So in principle, like, it's not like you need to go out and get it, but it can be inhibited. It can be, in a sense, weak, right? The degree of meta awareness can be weak for various reasons. And one of the things that is theoretically relevant here is the idea of what's called predictive processing. The idea that, and this is really a neuroscientific account, it has some parallels in interesting ways, perhaps, with Buddhism. It's the idea that the brain is a predictive mechanism, so that the way the brain operates is it's got a model of the self in the world, and it's constantly sort of running predictions about what's going to happen next. And then when the sensory information, so actually what you experience is not your sensory information, what you experience is your model. And then the sensory information gets, and then if the sensory information disagrees with that, then the sensory information is used to update the model. Like, for example, let's say I'm really used to a certain environment, like my office or whatever. I walk in and there's, I don't know, an avocado there. In the first moment, I don't even see the avocado. And like, it's gone in my retina, right? I've had that contact, but I don't see it. There's got to be because I'm so used to, I have such a strong model, stable model of that environment that I just don't even see it. So it takes a moment for that to update. So one theory about depression, at least some forms of depression, is that people with depression have very rigid models of self and world that are very negative, and that they can't update them. They have an issue with updating. So one way to deal with that actually is to try to enhance the updating process. But another way to deal with that is for them to experience the model as not real. And to do that, you have to experience the model as just mental, which means you need meta awareness first. So that's one way of thinking about how, with depressed people, just being in a state in which they are, practicing an open style, where they're just paying attention to experience in the moment. And the instructions you find in like modern mindfulness would be things like that sound very similar to, Mahmudra Dzogchen style instructions, like this, this right out of Touching It. Yeah, so that's very similar to what you find in modern mindfulness. This kind of a style actually is probably really helpful for people. So it's not really so much maybe getting used to something as actually letting go of something that is really important here. It's like letting go of that model of self and world and being able to still experience without that model running. Okay, I guess that's it. Am I right? So thank you very much.